All right, good afternoon, everyone. Going to work through just this slide deck pretty quickly on adolescence so that we have this ready to rock and roll for our exam on Wednesday. So, jumping into it, think about adolescence. When we think about adolescence from a developmental psychology standpoint, think about adolescence as this transition from what we might refer to as childhood into adulthood, kind of this in between, right? And what we're seeing during adolescence, a lot of changes physically, cognitively, and social emotionally that are coming up during this time period. In terms of physical development, what we see as the mark of adolescence is the onset of puberty. Okay, and what we're seeing here is the development of your primary sex characteristics. These are going to be basically reproductive organs. Primary sex characteristics, these are going to be testes, ovaries, things along those lines. But we're also going to see the development of secondary sex characteristics. For boys, this is going to be sort of the development of facial hair, deepening of the voice. Among women, the development of breasts, hips. So these are primary sex characteristics being, again, just the reproductive organs, secondary sex characteristics, things that generally characterize differences in men and women. We're also seeing during this period menarche in women. This is going to be the first menstrual period, as well as spermarchy in males, which is going to be the first ejaculation during adolescence. Okay. Now the thing is, the development for puberty varies widely. All right. Things they have like a mean time when things are going on, but this can begin as anywhere as early as 10 or sometimes earlier and start as late as 16, depending on some genetic factors, environmental factors, things along those lines that start to influence the onset of some of these physical changes. One of the things that we don't completely understand is we're seeing young women begin puberty earlier and earlier, which is something that we've noted but haven't been able to account for. This is important because we want to know sort of why we as humans are physically changing in this way. Also, at least within the United States, seeing certain types of risk factors or protective factors being associated with the timeline of development. So, again, something that people are interested in and trying to account for. Okay. We also see continuing changes in neurological development. During adolescence, we see continued synaptic pruning. Okay, remember, this is your brain becoming more efficient. So again, remember we talked about in infancy when you're first born, all sorts of connections, but all connections, everything going everywhere is not a super efficient system. So we're seeing continuing refinement of those connections, the strengthening of the ones that are important and that you use, and the sort of fading out of ones that are less important. So we see continued pruning, also specific brain regions continuing to develop, the frontal lobes being kind of your most important ones here. Okay. Again, these frontal lobes, right? Remember, these are at the front of your brain on each cortex, involved in planning, impulse control, attention, a lot of executive functioning and things along those lines. These are going to continue to develop through the mid-20s, okay? And so when we go through and we take a look at interventions like abstinence preventions and DARE, things along those lines, these are not interventions that work. All right. They seem like they should, like to just say no stuff. Seems like, oh, well, you just say no to drugs, say no to sex, things like that. But what we're doing is we're trying to implement these in individuals whose brakes, right, are still developing. And so we know just based on data that these don't work. It sounds like it would be a good idea, but they're just interventions that are not effective when we're looking broadly across the population. So little efficacy of these, and again, likely due at least to some extent with continuing development of the frontal lobes. We also see impacts of your environment. Okay, early childhood experiences. Again, when you're in childhood and infancy, things like basic stimulation, sort of being able to see different things and smell different things and touch different things, interact with your environment starts to be incredibly important. As we talked about before, we also see specific developmental windows for language. Okay. If children aren't receiving that attention and sort of being exposed to language, things along those lines, we're missing really critical periods where some of those capacities start to develop. Okay. And what we start to see is these environmental influences start to impact and be influenced and sort of be correlated with some neurological changes. We talked about Romanian orphanages in the last lecture, where you have these children who are being fed, but they just weren't being attended to, right? And you saw children who were should have been walking, should have interacting a long time ago, and they weren't, right? Again, so seeing this environmental factors going through and impacting down into the basic biology. Okay, so we've got that stuff going on. We also see influences of the family environment. What's interesting when we look through from a developmental standpoint, we see different things about sort of our identity and our psychology and our behavior being influenced more specifically by family, and other stuff that's more specifically by peers. Okay. When we look at the family environment, things like your values, work ethic, different belief structures, educational attainment, how you interact with authority figures, these seem to be very, very strongly influenced by the family that you were raised in. Okay. By contrast, your degree to which you're socially interacting with people, different lifestyle choices, how you cooperate and get along with other people, these are going to be impacted by your peers. Okay. So again, if we think back to that genetic piece of things that we were talking about, you can think about your family environment as kind of that shared environment. You and your family, just the way and the culture and how your family operates, these being for you, your behavior in some of these areas being very influenced by family environment, whereas peers think about this as your unique environment. This is stuff that's just unique to you. Your experiences right now in college are going through and continuing to refine and develop your future behavior and sort of lifestyle choices, interactions, and things along those lines. Okay. The thing to remember, however, is that sort of these sources of environmental influence are going to interact. Okay. So think back to when you were in high school, right? So parents may have been sort of more permissive, less permissive in terms of who, let's say, they let you hang out with in terms of peers, right? And so we've got family interacting peer group, but then you have peer group, the peers you're in, sort of bringing into your family, interacting that. And so just like the genetic stuff that we had talked about before, it's not necessarily just an additive contribution of family environment, peer environment, these things interacting together to start to influence you as a person, your choices, your behaviors, things along these lines, right? Because based on your family environment, you're more maybe likely to choose some peers versus others, right? And so we see that these two things being influenced by one another. Right. The other thing that starts to impact our behavior, identities, so how we go about the world, we want to be thinking about culture. Okay. Now, culture, broadly defined, is any group that shares ideas, attitude, behaviors, traditions, that's passed on along generations. And with generations, we can kind of think about this as broad versus narrow, right? If we want to think about culture as American culture, or as British culture, Australian culture, Chinese culture, Japanese culture, Russian culture, Belgian culture, right? We tend to think about culture at that level, right? But we can think about culture as much more broad or more specific, right? So we have sort of cultures based on gender. So male culture, kind of what that means. Women culture, kind of what goes along with that. We have culture surrounding different socio-political beliefs, right? We can have cultures that are developed around certain sort of interest groups or things along those lines. Basically, any high school like teen movie that you see, right, where you've got like jocks and theater kids and sort of this, that, like we can think about these generally as different types of cultures and subcultures, okay? When we go through and thinking about what makes a culture, and so how we go through and define, norms start to become an important piece of this, okay? Norms are going to be the rules for behavior and what's accepted within a certain culture. Okay, so if we think about American society, right, we tend to be, let's say, in terms of the expression of emotion, so we can go through and express emotion, but within bounds, right? In other cultures, right, if we think about sort of historically sort of Italian cultures or some Spanish cultures, sort of much more expressive in terms of what's appropriate in terms of the display of social emotion, things along those lines. However, if you go to, let's say, Japanese culture, right, many, many more rules in terms of what's appropriate to display in terms of emotion with family versus coworkers versus other types of things, right? And what happens when we go through and violate those expectations, we know, right? What's interesting is that there's not a rule book. You don't get, you're not born within the U.S. and here's like your rule book of things that you need to go through and figure out. We just learn this by picking it up, by being around other people, right? But as soon as you go out and you break those rules, that becomes very apparent very quickly, okay? If we think about things in terms of just cultural dress, right? If I were to wear things that I got from a different country and wear them here in the U.S., it might be still sort of covering all parts of my body that I think sort of everybody agrees should be covered, but it would look very, very strange because I would have violated a norm, right? I would have violated a dress norm. It wouldn't be something that people kind of figured out eventually. It would be something that stood out very quickly, right? And so thinking about norms as the unwritten rules for accepted behavior within a culture, okay? And same thing, right? We have like countercultures and things like that. And you say, well, I'm part of this culture and we're, fight against the establishment rules and things along those lines, which is awesome. Except for if you go through and violate the rules and the culture and the norms of that specific group, it still sticks out to sort of people within that culture, right? And so this is, as much as we can want to be our own unique, independent person, culture is very, very strong in the rules of culture, and whatever cultures you ascribe to and are being involved in, all have very strict rules in terms of what's acceptable behavior, what's not, and this is where the norms come in. Okay. Now, the one thing to remember is that culture is not a static thing. Culture goes through and changes. Things that were not acceptable in American culture, say 50 years ago, now are widely accepted, right? Things like women in the workplace, right? Standards around sexual identity and things along those lines have progressed quite a bit farther than they were, let's say, in the 1950s, right? If you go to any other country and we're trying to follow the rules from 60 years ago, you would probably be out of step with what was going on now. So even though we talk about culture as kind of this broad monolithic thing, always important to remember that culture is not static. Culture goes through and changes, just like everything else. That's probably a good thing, right? We grow and change, but still what we start to see is changes around that norm, around those norms, those expected rules, for behavior, and these things going through and sort of starting to impact how we as individual people interact with each other, with ourselves, with society, things like that. Okay. All right. So now that we've got some of the different experiences and sort of influences down, I want to jump back into some psychological theory. Okay. We're going to talk about Erikson here, but not, I just want to give you an overview of Erikson. I just want you to know what Erikson, what his contribution was. So about the time, so we've got, thinking about it in this developmental section, we talked about stage theories of development, right? We've talked about stage theories of cognition. These stage theories are kind of all the rage, right, in mid-century America in terms of these groups of psychologists who are working on this stuff. And about this time, there's a gentleman named Erik Erikson who started to sort of become interested in how we develop socially. So what Erikson did some early work researching child rearing practices in different indigenous tribes and sort of looked at the influence of sort of the culture on the types of goals that people acquired, the types of values that were sort of characteristic of an individual group. And what Eric did was he looked back to say, hey, we've got these stage theories of development, we've got these stage theories of cognition. What about I wonder if social development happens in certain stages that we could reproduce and sort of follow across individuals within an individual culture. Okay, and so Erickson went through and proposed a stage theory of social development that was proposing distinct universal stages that occur over the course of the lifespan. Okay, one of the reactions here was Erickson looking at say Piaget, right? Piaget hit like age 12 and then said everything beyond that is just kind of whatever, right? What was interesting about Erickson is he picked the ball up and said, hey, people continue to go through and grow and change throughout adulthood. Sort of who you are right now, where you're at, sitting in your computer listening to this right now, is probably not going to be the exact same person you are 20 years from now, 50 years from now, right? As we grow and we develop, our goals change, our values change. There's some stability, but there are things that are become more important to us and less important to us as we move forward, okay? And so what was interesting about Erickson is his theory of social development carried things from childhood all the way through late adulthood, okay? And what he had proposed that each stage involved some sort of psychosocial problem that required a solution. And if you address that problem, you were good. You're going through, you move on to that next stage and you're fine. Okay. But if you were to run up against a stage and you say did successfully resolve that stage, right? So if you are in a stage where the main crisis here, the main task is to develop trust, right? And you weren't able to accomplish that because you did not have supportive caregivers or something along those lines. Within Erickson's model, Erickson would say that then you would then be kind of stuck at that stage and would continue to experience problems with sort of the development of trust and relationships as you move forward because of some unresolved issues at an earlier stage. Okay, so if this sounds super psychodynamic, that's right, because it was heavily influenced by Freud at the time. And so what was really, really interesting about Erickson's model is he was taking sort of the stage idea, the stage theory of development, and taking it from where we had talked about it in terms of physical development and cognitive development, and moved this into how we grow and develop as social creatures. Now, at the end of the day, and so why we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, is there's not a lot of support for this idea, okay? When we go through, it looks like there's sort of many, many different things that go through and impact socialization. If you had a rough time at one stage of your life, that doesn't necessarily mean you're indefinitely screwed for down other parts of your life. There's a lot of Freudian stuff going on here that doesn't quite play out the way that we see in terms of evidence and stuff like that. And so not something that we're going to spend a lot of time on, although you probably hit on it in the book, read about it, but just kind of know for our purposes, so the contribution of Erickson, and kind of a big name, and why Erickson is on all the textbooks is because of sort of some initiating groundbreaking work in terms of thinking about social development and how do we go through and understand that, okay? So not exactly the theory itself didn't turn out to be sort of all that strong, but it's hard to sort of fault someone for giving it a shot. So just know what Erickson did, kind of how his ideas sort of kind of picked the ball up and kept it moving, but that's about all you need to worry about in terms of Erickson stuff. All right. Last stage theory we're going to talk about, and this is pretty cool, is Kohlberg's stage theory of moral development. So again, similar to the stuff that we just talked about in terms of Erickson's work. Erickson was seeing in developmental psychology these different stage theories. Kohlberg came in and was kind of had some of the same influences. But what Kohlberg was interested in was looking at how people develop moral sense, how we go through and develop as moral beings, how we determine the difference between right and wrong, and how we go through and think about things, okay? So again, strongly influenced by Piaget's work. Again, sort of this idea of like looking at stage theory of cognitive development and thinking, hey, could we apply this to how we as humans develop moral judgment? And what was really cool about Kohlberg's work was some of the research he did. Is he went through and presented, would bring people in, right, different age groups, and present scenarios that had some character involved in some sort of moral dilemma. Now, the classic example here is known as Heinz dilemma. Okay, Heinz dilemma is here on the slide. I've sort of made some adjustments from sort of so it makes more sense than it's in the 50s. But let's say, so it says Heinz's wife was near death. Her only hope was a drug developed by a local pharmacist. The drug cost $2,000 to make, and the pharmacist was willing to sell it for $20,000. Heinz could only raise $10,000. He offered the pharmacist all his savings, promised to pay the rest later. Pharmacist refused, saying he needed to make a profit on his discovery. Heinz became desperate and broke into the store to steal the drug. Should he have done this? Okay, so the idea behind what was going on in terms of Kohlberg's research on his theory of moral development was bringing people in and presenting them with scenarios like this. Okay. And what was really cool was not whether or not Kohlberg wasn't interested in whether participants felt like the behavior was justified or not, right? So if you were to say, oh, that was okay for Heinz to do, or it wasn't okay for Heinz to do, didn't matter. What Kohlberg was interested in is why people were justifying they thought that the action was right or wrong. And based on these justifications, right, he went through and developed a theory of moral development that had people moving through sort of different types of characteristic stages based on how they were thinking about justifying their answer. Okay. So, what I want you to focus on here, we're going to go through, within this theory, there's three kind of like higher order group or stages. And then within each higher order stage, there's a couple of lower order things. Focus on sort of the main higher order things here. Okay. So here at the earliest stage, in early childhood, Kohlberg was noting explanations for whether or not things were right or wrong, and grouped this into a stage that he labeled pre-conventional morality. And what characterizes pre-conventional morality, and this you see this in early childhood, is that justifications tend to be egocentric. They tend to be based on just Heinz the person, right? And what we see is people making decisions about whether something is right or wrong based on either punishment or to gain reward, but specifically for just Heinz the person, right? Because Heinz is the target of this scenario, right? So in the earliest stage that Kohlberg identified as obedience and punishment, what we're seeing at this level are decisions that are based on knowledge of consequences, punishment, things like that, right? So someone might say, and this is early childhood, would say like, well, it's wrong to steal. You would get punished for stealing. So Heinz shouldn't have done that because it's wrong to steal. You'd get punished, right? Or someone might say, no, it was fine for him. He asked first, and it's fine if you ask first. If you ask first, then it's okay, right? So you've got some very basic low-level sort of reasoning that's based just on consequences, punishment, things along these lines, okay? Now, still within pre-conventional morality, but the next stage here is going to be a stage called individualism and exchange. Here we're seeing that people start to make their rationales based on personal benefit or gain, okay? So we're seeing decisions being based on sort of the sort of your own personal interests here, right? And so someone might say, well, it was okay for Heinz to steal the drug because the pharmacist wouldn't give him a fair deal, right? So very black and white thinking, like, well, he asked, pharmacist wouldn't give him a fair deal on it, so I guess that was, he was fine to go through and take it, right? Or maybe someone says no. You're like, well, he could get put in jail for longer than he can stand, right? So again, across these two stages, what we're seeing is a reasoning of right or wrong based on Hines as just the consequences for Hines, right? So at this level, for early level of moral reasoning, what we're seeing is all the justifications focus just on what happens to Hines, right? Based on some black and white ideas of what's right or wrong, or what sort of is good for Hines or not good for Hines, okay? And so this early development, or this early stage, is what Kohlberg identified as pre-conventional morality. Now, once we get into early adolescence, we start to see things get a little bit more nuanced. Okay, and this is where Kohlberg drew the line and sort of identified what he referred to as conventional morality, right? And what we see, kind of the characteristic of a conventional morality, is we see rules being obeyed to maintain social order, to gain approval, things along these lines, okay? So in stage 3, and again, stage 3 and 4 both fall under conventional morality. But at stage 3, you start to see things being less focused just on Hines the individual, and start to take into consideration more social types of things. So at stage 3, we see decisions that are based on social approval. You hear this good boy, nice girl types of reasoning, okay? So like, well, it was okay because he loved his wife. Anyone would do that, right? So the idea is Hines was justified in stealing the drug because he loved his wife. And good people love their spouses and their parents and things along those lines. Anybody would do that, so it was okay for him to do that, right? Conversely, someone might say, well, stealing would make him a criminal. People don't like criminals, right? Before, we weren't worried about sort of your label or status as a criminal. It was just like Hines would go to jail or not. Here, now we're at stage 3. We're introducing this social concept of criminality, right? And criminals are bad, right? Stealing would make Hines a criminal, and therefore it wasn't a right thing to do, okay? So we're staying in conventional morality, expanding beyond Hines to start to think about other different social factors, okay? And so at stage 3, we're thinking about like sort of basically your decisions are based on what will other people think about me. At stage 4, we start to level up into thinking about some ideas that have to go not just about what other people are thinking about you, but think about social order, sort of laws and things like that, right? So here you might see at this level someone saying like, well, stealing was wrong. People can't just take whatever they want, right? So this is kind of like, oh, hey, we as a society need to have some rules, right? Or maybe you would see someone say, well, he could steal the drug, but he would have to face the consequences, right? So again, recognizing that, hey, here are the rules. I understand why you did it, but if you do it, here are the consequences we have as a society have set up. So it's kind of your choice. I think it's fine, but there may be consequences to that, right? So the thing that we're seeing in conventional morality is an expansion of people's reasoning and sort of their consideration of right or wrong that goes from just at pre-conventional morality, just about Hines himself. Like we're not thinking about society at all. At conventional morality, we're expanding out and starting to consider social impacts, right? Either what other people think about you or how we function as a society, and sort of some of those types of things coming in. Last higher order stage is what Kohlberg referred to as post-conventional morality, okay? Once we get to this stage, we start to see, and he identified this as generally adolescence and belong, we start to see more reasoning that's driven mostly by personal beliefs and basic rights, ethical principles, and things like that, okay? So again, before, it's like, what do other people think about me? What are the rules for society? Now we're starting to get into sort of higher order ethical types of thinking. So stage 5, what Kohlberg referred to as the social contract, we see decision making based on differing opinions and values, and some democratic types of ideas, sort of compromise stuff. Say, well, it was okay because it was Hines' duty to save his wife. Now, there may be consequences, but authorities should consider the circumstances, okay? So this is different than sort of kind of the similar one we saw in the previous stage where like, well, he could do it, but he might have to face the consequences. Here we're saying like, yeah, there could be consequences, but whoever's making the determination, the jury, the judge, they should sort of think about the circumstances and what's happening, right? Alternatively, someone could say, no, it was wrong for him to steal the drug. His situation was understandable, but the scientist has a right to be compensated, right? So we're thinking about sort of not just sort of what the rules are on the books in terms of society, but starting to think about the rights of Hines, the rights of his wife, the rights of the scientists, things along those lines, right? Stage 6, again, still under post-conventional morality. This is kind of the highest level, okay? And what we're seeing here are justifications that are based on universal principles of justice, dignity, things that, we certainly as a democracy have rules that sort of keep things in order, but there are arguments that, sometimes it's fine to break the law or sometimes it's not, sort of based on basic human rights, okay? So someone at this stage might say Hines was justified. Human life is worth more than property in any situation. Say this person is saying doesn't matter, right? He didn't physically hurt anyone, right? Human life is always sort of should be the priority over someone's pocketbook. And so, yes, Hines was justified then. So what we're doing is we're sort of pulling in this basic belief that human life should be at the highest value relative to sort of what your labor has put into something, right? But conversely, someone say Hines' actions were not justified. Others' lives were equally important, might have needed the medication, right? The idea here being like, well, Hines went and stole that, and so now there's not any medicine for other people who also need it, and so Hines was actually behaving selfishly, and it was not ethical for him to go through it. It wasn't right for him to take it because he's now impacted other people, right? So again, we're starting to see sort of this idea of equity coming in, sort of in fair treatment, things along those lines, right? That again is going the opposite direction. So again, what was really, really interesting and really cool about how Kohlberg set this up was focusing not on whether or not people thought what the answer to the ethical dilemma was, whether or not they said he was justified or not justified. What Kohlberg was interested in is how people went through and sort of reasoned out how these different scenarios. And what we saw based on Kohlberg's work is that we start sort of very sort of egocentric, very focused on just the person who was the target of it. We level up into conventional morality, where we start to sort of pull in ideas about society, sort of what other people will think, and then post-conventional morality. Think about this as kind of this higher order level of ethical reasoning that starts to take on sort of basic foundational ethical principles and sort of beliefs about justice, dignity, things along those ends. You start to see things level up as we move through. Okay, so again, don't worry about individual stages so much as this as the pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional morality in terms of thinking about Kohlberg's work. All right, that's it. Go through, make sure you read the lecture summary slide, read through the comprehension check slide. So if you have questions, shoot me an email, come in during office hours. We'll get you squared away. Thanks for being patient and sort of working through this. Again, hopefully this kind of lays out stuff. It's less fun for me to do this stuffed up in front of a computer screen, but hopefully it gets you the information. All right. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.